Scripture speaks of two special people called the two witnesses, who will have such strong faith and power that they will cause many of the miracles and plagues to come about as described in the book of Revelation. But who are these individuals? Are they living now? And what exactly will they do? This portion of John's revelation begins with John being given, quote, a reed like unto a rod, and he is asked to measure the temple of God. It is likely that John saw something like this. This is a stick made out of reed and comes from the Greek word which is translated canon. We refer to the scriptures as canon because they are the laws by which we should measure our lives. John is then told to, quote, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court, which is without the temple, leave out, and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. This is referring to the 3.5-year period just prior to Christ's return to the Mount of Olives, where he saves the Jews after Armageddon. These two witnesses will be given power to prophesy for 2,260 days, which is 3.5 years. So verse 2 describes Jerusalem being under siege and these two witnesses protecting it during that time. Notice they are given the power and authority to prophesy to an entire nation during that time, a privilege only given to prophets. I'm not talking about the prophet of the church, but rather the more general distinction of a prophet, seer, and revelator, which many can hold at the same time. This was such an important question of Joseph Smith's. He asked about who they were and received a direct revelation back about which we find in Doctrine and Covenants 77 verse 15. In this unique question and answer session with the Lord refers to them as prophets. He also gives more details when this will happen, as it will be after the Jews are gathered, after they have rebuilt the city of Jerusalem in the last days. This also gives us a clue as to who they are, as it says that they will be, quote, raised up to the Jewish nation in the last days. But we will come back to that. The timeline around the two witnesses is well defined within Scripture. These two will prophesy to Jerusalem and protect them for the 3.5 years prior to Christ's return, where he saves the Jews from annihilation. All this happens after the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Isaiah called these prophets two sons and said that they were the only hope of deliverance for Israel because they would be, quote, full of the fury of the Lord. Revelations 11:4 says that these two witnesses are the two olive trees and the two candlesticks. This is a reference to Zechariah chapter 4 verses 11 to 14. This is where you can study further these symbols for yourself and come to your own conclusions, but my study leads me to believe that this discusses two special individuals that will have the sealing power, which is what is described next in Revelation 11. Verses 5 and 6 of Revelation 11 describe some of their powers, including destroying the enemies with fire and causing droughts and plagues. But who are these two witnesses? Bruce R. McConkie said that these two prophets, no doubt that they will be members of the Council of the 12 or the First Presidency of the Church. But I'm not so sure. Could there be hints of their identities found in the Scriptures? Back to Zechariah 4, notice in verse 14 it refers to these as the two anointed ones that stand by the Lord. Those that stand on the left and the right hand of the Lord is discussed in Matthew 20. Where the mother of James and John ask if her sons may sit on the right and left hand of Christ in his kingdom. He answers that it isn't his to grant, but, quote, whom is prepared of my Father. Zechariah talked about one on the left and one on the right. If you look at the Hebrew, that can also mean north and south. Could one clue be that one would come from the northern kingdom of Israel, while the other from the south? Because remember, D&C 77 said that they will be, quote, raised up to the Jewish nation. That doesn't sound like a member of the Quorum of the 12 to me, so who could it be? I think D&C 61 verse 14 may answer this for us, where it says, quote, behold, I, the Lord, in the beginning blessed the waters, but in the last days, by the mouth of my servant John, I cursed the waters. Notice here that John isn't just the biblical writer of the last days narrative, but actually the one that curses the waters. Some might say that the Lord is referring to the revelation of the plagues by John here and not him actually performing them, but I'm not so sure. In the Guide to the Scriptures about John, it says that John has an important work to do during his time in the earth in the New Testament times and in the last days. Why would it say this unless John was to take an active role during the final events in the last days? It also says that, quote, John did not die, but was allowed to remain on the earth as a ministering servant until the time of the Lord's second coming. Coincidence? Remember, the Lord promised in Matthew 16 that some standing there would not taste death, quote, till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Is there someone else that this could be referring to other than John? John 21 talks about one that will, quote, tarry until Christ's return. I find it interesting that the word tarry has a cross-reference that leads to Revelations 10, verse 11, which says, And he said unto me, Thou must prophesy again before many people and nations and tongues and kings. John is told that he will have to prophesy again. Could this be referring to him being one of the two witnesses? This is further described in Doctrine and Covenants 7, where Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in 1829, using the Urim and Thummim, asked if John was allowed to tarry in the flesh or if he had died. It was revealed that he had been allowed to tarry and would have a greater work to do than what he had done. It says he has undertaken a greater work, and says that he will make himself a flaming fire and a ministering angel. Very similar language of that described of the two witnesses. You can also read more about this in 3 Nephi chapter 28, verses 6 through 12, where the three Nephites are given the power to tarry, and Christ compares their desire to the same desire John the Beloved had. And no surprise, John is Jewish. Again, who the two witnesses are is purely speculation, but if John could be one of the two witnesses, then who would be the other? Well, it wouldn't be Peter or James or anyone else from the New Testament times, as they were all killed. However, when you think about John being held back and translated so that he could perform this work, you have to ask yourself who else has been translated and could fill the other spot. There are the three Nephites, but they are not Jewish, nor is their responsibility to those in Jerusalem. Plus, there are three of them. There is Moses, who was translated, but again, not Jewish. There was Enoch, but he will be returning with the city of Enoch during the millennium, so it isn't him. Not to mention he's also not Jewish. There were other unnamed people who says that they were translated, but they were caught up to the city of Enoch as well, so presumably they will return with Enoch in that city. But there is a Jew that did have the sealing power and was translated. Elijah, one of my very favorite Old Testament prophets. You remember the many miracles he performed, including calling down fire from heaven against the priests of Baal. The Bible is silent on Elijah's tribe. However, tradition is that he was a Jew, although he may not have been raised in the region of Judah, but rather in the northern kingdom. Could it be that Isaiah is talking about Elijah in Isaiah 41, verse 25, where it says, quote, I have raised up one from the north, and he shall come from the rising of the sun, shall I call upon my name, and he shall come upon princes, as upon mortar, and as the potter treadeth clay. Could this be talking about the other witness who clearly has unparalleled faith and the ability to control the elements? Could these princes be referring to Gog in the land of Magog in the last days? For more on this, there is a video about Armageddon. By the way, there may be a clue why no one from our dispensation is selected to be one of the two witnesses in Isaiah 41 verses 26 through 29, but I'll let you study that on your own. In the Guide to the Scriptures about Elijah, it says, Elijah ministered to the northern kingdoms of Israel, that he performed many miracles. At his request, God prevented rain for 3.5 years. Remember what it says in Revelations 11. These witnesses will shut the heavens, and it will not rain during the days of their ministry, which will be 3.5 years. Elijah was the last prophet to hold the sealing power of the Melchizedek priesthood before the time of Christ. He in fact gave the sealing power to John at the Mount of Transfiguration, described in Matthew 17, verse 3. This would make Elijah and John the last living individuals with this power prior to Joseph Smith. All of this is in preparation for the second coming of the Lord as spoken of in Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6. Perhaps Elijah's work described in Malachi 4:5 goes beyond just passing the sealing power to Joseph Smith, or speaking about temple work. Doctrine and Covenants 110 says, quote, "After this vision had closed, another great and glorious vision burst upon us. For Elijah the prophet, who was taken to heaven without tasting death, stood before us, and said, Behold, the time is fully come, which was spoken of by the mouth of Malachi, testifying that he, Elijah, should be sent, before the great and dreadful day of the Lord come, quote, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the children to the fathers, lest the whole earth be smitten with a curse." Not only does this confirm that Elijah never tasted death, but also, at the point the gospel is rejected by the Gentiles, the earth will be smitten with a curse. There is another video on the times of the Gentiles, but Elijah's mission sure sounds like it goes beyond just confirming the sealing keys to Joseph Smith. Could this curse be the drought spoken of in Revelations 11 that the two witnesses will bring about? I really hope not, because this will be a worldwide drought for 3.5 years, and it doesn't sound like a lot of fun. In fact, I wonder if when it is said that, quote, "in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every word be established," it wasn't talking about the 2 witnesses spoken of in Revelations for what will happen in Jerusalem in the last days, and the 3 Nephites being the witnesses for Zion in the New Jerusalem in the last days. Just something to noodle on there. In fact, if you want something interesting to study, you should research the law of witnesses. Regardless of who actually ends up being the 2 witnesses, they will prophesy while keeping what is described in Joel 2:2 as the largest army ever assembled at bay during their 3.5-year ministry. This is the latter-day abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. This is also known as Armageddon. As you can see here in Daniel, the 3.5-year period is mentioned again. This scene of bloodshed and devastation is described by several ancient prophets. Even our modern-day prophets describe this as the final conflict before the Lord comes. Revelation 11 describes how Israel is defended from these massive armies by the 2 witnesses. Then, after 3.5 years, the 2 prophets will be captured and killed by the opposing army. Their bodies will be left in the streets of Jerusalem for 3.5 days, as the forces of evil engage in a great celebration over their death. The army then ravages the city and all who remain in it. Zechariah says that only 1/3 of the nation of Israel will survive this final extremity when the city shall be taken. Revelations 11 verses 11 and 12 describe what happens next. It says, quote, "And after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet. And great fear fell upon them which saw them. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them." Then at the moment Jerusalem and its inhabitants are about to be annihilated, the Lord's fury will be unleashed. This is the moment that Christ returns to the Mount of Olives, where it splits. An earthquake will strike the earth, affecting the whole earth. The greatest earthquake the world has ever known. At the same time, many plagues that mirror those brought upon Egypt at the time of Moses happen again. As you can see, these 2 witnesses are part of the winding up scene just prior to the final judgments being poured out upon the wicked and the Lord ushering in the millennium. Remember that when Christ saves the Jews, that is not Christ's second coming in glory, where everyone sees him at once. That comes sometime later. But for this series of events with the 2 witnesses, as well as the second coming, this is what Christ is referring to in Matthew 26:41 when he says, "Watch and pray."